Welcome to Bedtime Scaries. We're finally here. You can feel it, can't you? The thrill and fear in the air. Stay close, watch each other, and watch your step as we journey to our end. Tonight's story is the final part of Penpal by Dathan Auerbach, titled Friends. On the first day of kindergarten, my mom had elected to drive me to school. We were both nervous, and she wanted to be there with me all the way up to the moment I walked into class. It took me a bit longer to get ready in the morning due to my still mending arm. The cast came up a couple inches past my elbow, which meant that I had to cover the entire arm with a specially designed latex bag when I showered. The bag was built to pull tight around the opening in order to seal out any water that might otherwise destroy the cast. Since I still had use of my dominant hand, I had gotten really adept at cinching the bag myself. That morning, however, perhaps due to my excitement or nervousness, I hadn't pulled the strap tight enough, and halfway through the shower, I could feel water pooling inside the bag around my fingers. I jumped out and tore the latex shield away, but could feel that the previously rigid plaster had become soft after absorbing water. Because there's no way to effectively clean the area between your body and the cast, the dead skin that would normally have fallen away merely sits there. When stirred by moisture, like sweat, it emits an odor, and apparently this odor is proportionate to the amount of moisture introduced, because soon after I began attempting to dry it, I was struck by the powerful stench of rot. As I continued to rub it frantically with the towel, the cast began to disintegrate into thick white strips that rained down upon my feet, while small white flakes wafted into the air and seemed to hover like snowflakes. I was growing increasingly distressed. I had put as much effort as a child could into his very first day of school. I had sat with my mom picking out my clothes the night before. I had spent a great deal of time picking out my backpack, and I had become exceedingly excited to show everyone my lunchbox that had the Ninja Turtles on it. I had fallen into my mom's habit of calling these children I hadn't yet met my friends already, but as the condition of my cast worsened, I became deeply upset at the thought that surely I wouldn't be able to apply that label to anyone by the time this day was over. When I realized that attempting to wipe the cast dry was actually destroying it, I wrapped the towel around my arm and pressed it hard against my chest while leaning forcefully against the counter, in an effort to soak up the water without agitating the surface of the cast. But the wet plaster began to collapse under my weight, and the force transferred down to my weak and cracked bones. Pain arced through my arm, and I half-successfully stifled a scream. I couldn't fix it myself. Defeated, I showed my mom. It took 30 minutes to get most of the moisture out while working to preserve the rest of the cast. The combination of placing restrained pressure on an absorbent cloth while running a hairdryer over the length of the cast was enough to solve the hydration issue. To address the problem of the smell, my mom cut off slivers of a bar of soap and slid them down into the cast. She then rubbed the remainder of the soap on the outside in an attempt to cocoon the rancid smell inside of a more pleasant one. There was no repair work that could be done, but she had at least controlled the damage. By the time we arrived in school, my classmates were already engaged in their second activity, and the teacher shoehorned me into one of the already established groups. I'm sure that the teacher explained to me in great detail what the guidelines of the activity were, but I was so nervous and distracted that I must have misunderstood. Within 5 minutes, I had violated the rules so badly that each member of the group complained to the teacher and asked why I had to be in their group. The teacher tried to make peace, but the damage was done. I sat at the table with my free hand in my pocket. I had brought a marker to school in hopes that I could collect some signatures or drawings on my cast next to my mother's, and as I rolled the marker between my fingertips, I suddenly felt very foolish for having even put it in my pocket that morning. After the exercise was over, We watched as our teacher brought a large rolled-up piece of paper out of the classroom's closet. While it was generally difficult to maintain the attention of so many children, the size of the object held our interest. We watched as she tacked the top and bottom left-hand corners of the paper to the wall as she talked to us. When the corners were secure, she unrolled the large cylinder of paper from left to right, and we saw what it was. It was a map. The teacher had us line up to leave the classroom for lunch. When we filled the lunchroom, the faculty members from each group guided us to our cluster of tables and corrected students who tried to sit at restricted yet unoccupied seats. There were no other students here. Kindergartners had the lunchroom to themselves at my elementary school, and this meant that I wouldn't have to sit by myself. In a year's time, I would be all alone at a table about 8 feet away, but despite the fact that I was surrounded by classmates, I think I felt lonelier right then than in all the initial weeks of my first grade isolation combined. One of the faculty members was making an announcement that no one seemed to be listening to, while most of the kids were chatting energetically. I was eavesdropping on their conversations, while self-consciously picking at the fraying ends of my cast, when a kid sat across from me. "I like your lunchbox," he said. I could tell that he was making fun of me, and I grew really angry. In my mind, that lunchbox was the last good thing about my day. I had used it every day at home since my mom had gotten it for me. She would make me sandwiches and put them in my lunchbox, and I would carry it to the white dining room table and eat them. It wasn't for practice, I was just excited to use it. Lunch that day in school was the first time I had used my lunchbox out of the house, and despite everything that had happened with my cast and the group earlier that day, I was still excited to use it officially. I didn't look up from my arm to face my classmate because I felt burning in my eyes from tears that I was holding back. As I struggled to maintain my composure, I looked up to tell the kid to leave me alone. But before I could get the words out, I saw something that made me pause. He had the exact same lunchbox. I laughed. "I like your lunchbox too. I think Michelangelo is the coolest," he said, while miming nunchuck moves. It was the first conversation I had ever had with another kid my own age that wasn't guided or chaperoned by my mother. While I had a lot of freedom in my neighborhood, there weren't any other kids that were my age, so when I played alone. Even though this new dynamic made me slightly nervous, it was a good kind of nervous. I was speaking up to rebut his preference by saying that Raphael was my favorite, when he knocked his open carton of milk off the table and onto his lap. "Aw, crap!" he said, and immediately covered his mouth with both hands and reflexively shifted his eyes from side to side to see who might have heard it. I tried very hard to stifle my laughter since I didn't know him at all, but the struggling look on my face must have struck him as funny because he started laughing first. Suddenly, I didn't feel so bad about my cast, and thought this person would hardly notice now anyway. As we laughed with one another, I thought to try my luck. "Hey, do you want to sign my cast?" As I worked the marker out of my pocket, he asked me how I broke my arm. I told him I fell out of the tallest tree in my neighborhood, and he seemed impressed. I watched him laboriously draw his name on my cast, pausing before each letter to draw it in the air to make sure it felt right. When he was done, I asked him what it said. He told me it said, Josh. Josh and I had lunch together every day, and whenever we could, we partnered up for projects. We became really close very quickly, to the point that if Josh was ever absent from school, I would feel a bit lost the entire day. We worked well together both within and outside of the curriculum of our grade. I helped him with his handwriting, and when I could, his spelling, and he took the blame when I wrote fart on the wall in permanent marker. I would come to know other kids, but I think I knew even then that Josh was my only real friend. Moving a friendship outside of school when you're 5 years old is actually more difficult than most remember. The Friday we launched our balloons, the atmosphere was so energetic and excited that when I had finished transcribing my letter, I joined Josh at his desk and asked him if he wanted to come to my house after school to play and maybe even stay the night. He said he did, and that he'd bring some toys. I said that we could also go exploring the woods around my house. When I got home, I asked my mom if Josh could come to our house, and she said that would be fine. My enthusiasm was boundless until I realized that I had no way of contacting Josh to tell him. I spent the whole weekend worrying that our friendship would have dissolved by Monday. When I saw him after the weekend, I was relieved to find that he had run into the same obstacle and thought that it was funny. Later that week, we both remembered to write down our phone numbers at home and then exchange them at school. My mom spoke with Josh's dad, and it was decided that she would pick up Josh and me from school that Friday. We alternated this basic structure nearly every weekend. If we managed to make plans far enough in advance, we could even secure permission slips from our parents so that we could just get off the bus with each other at either his or my house. The fact that we lived so close to one another made arrangements much easier for our parents, who seemed to work constantly. As time moved along, I found it more difficult to imagine doing things without Josh. That's not to say I actively tried to imagine such things, but as an only child, I had never had the disposition to picture myself with anyone else, except maybe my mother. As Josh and I grew closer, however, whenever I thought of a new place to go or a new activity to try, I always reflexively inserted Josh into that scenario. We had so many adventures when I lived in my old house that I find it difficult to remember them all. The actual nature of what we were doing never really seemed to have an impact on how fun the activity was for us. As long as we were together, we had a good time. When my mom and I moved across the city during that summer in the first grade, I was sure our friendship had seen its last day. As we drove away from the house that I had lived in my whole life, I felt a sadness that I knew wasn't just about a house. I was saying goodbye to my friend, forever. But, to my surprise and delight, Josh and I stayed close. Despite the fact that we spent the majority of our time apart and only saw each other on weekends, we remained remarkably similar as we grew. Our personalities coalesced, our senses of humor complemented each other's, and we would often find that we started liking new things independently. I would sometimes call Josh, or he would call me, to share information about some new TV show or toy, only to find that it was old news for the other. We even sounded enough alike that when I stayed with Josh, he would sometimes call my mom pretending to be me. His success rate was impressive. My mom would sometimes joke that the only way she could tell us apart sometimes was by our hair. He had straight, dirty blonde hair like his sister, while I had curly, dark brown hair like my mother. One would think that the thing most likely to drive two young friends apart would be what's out of their control. I'm quite sure that many friendships have stagnated when one party is forced to move away, parents thinking that their children will just make new friends. While I feared at the time that this would be the case for us, I think the catalyst of our gradual disengagement was my insistence that we sneak out to my old house to look for boxes. That night, perhaps because we were old enough to reflect on it appropriately, seemed to cause a rift between us. Not a striking and violent rift, but a gradual one. Like two continents parting ways. The weekend after our excursion, I invited Josh over to my house, in keeping with our tradition of alternating houses, but he said that he wasn't really feeling up to it. If I'm honest, neither was I, so I didn't protest. But maybe I should have. We began seeing progressively less of one another over the next year or so. Our time together had gone from once a week to once a month to once every couple of months. Unlike when we were kids, we seemed to struggle to find things to do or talk about. But it was all gradual enough that perhaps we didn't notice it, even if we might have felt it. For my 12th birthday, Mom threw a party for me. I hadn't made that many friends since we'd moved, so it wasn't a surprise party since my mom didn't know who to invite. I'd told the handful of kids with whom I'd become acquainted, but I was fine with a smaller party. I didn't want to invite a person just because I recognized him in the hallway. About a week before the party, I called Josh to see if he wanted to come. He said he didn't think he could make it. My mom had planned a lot of games and activities. There would be a piñata, pin the tail on the donkey, and She even convinced a coworker to come perform part of his amateur magic show. It occurred to me as we sat on the phone in silence that Josh might think he was too old for these activities, and I tried to reassure him that he didn't have to play any of the games or watch the magician, but he just said that he didn't feel up to a party. He said, maybe some other time, and we hung up. After the phone call, I told my mom I didn't want to have a party. I told her I was too old for those games and magicians were for kids. I told her that the whole thing was a dumb idea that she never should have had. The conversation with Josh hurt me tremendously, and senselessly, the only thing that I could think to do was try to hurt her. It didn't work, and she just smiled and put her arm around my shoulder and said, "It'll be fine, sweetheart." And inexplicably, I felt better. The day before the party, Josh called me in better spirits to say that he would be there. It had been several months since I had seen him, and I was excited that we would get to spend time together and not have to worry about what to do or what to talk about, since there would be activities. I wasn't sure why he had changed his mind, but it didn't really matter to me. He was coming. The party went pretty well. My biggest concern was that Josh and the other kids wouldn't get along, but they seemed to like each other well enough. Josh was quieter than I'd hoped he'd be. He hadn't brought me a gift, and he apologized for that, but I told him it wasn't a big deal. I was just glad he was able to make it. I tried to start several conversations with him, but they seemed to keep reaching dead ends. I didn't know what else to do. I had acclimated to the timid disposition that he had developed over the last couple of years, but I had hoped things might be different that day. I asked him what was wrong. I told him that I didn't get why things had become so awkward between us. They were never like that before. We used to hang out almost every weekend and talk on the phone every couple days. I suspected that it all really was because of the night we snuck back to my old house, and even though I couldn't know for certain, my voice trembled and quaked as I told him that Boxes was my cat, and that it wasn't fair for him to hold that night against me for so long. But he didn't say anything. At a loss, I asked him what happened to us. He looked up from staring at his shoes and just said, "You left." I was about to ask Josh what he meant when my mom yelled from the other room that it was time to open presents. I forced a smile and walked into the dining room as they sang "Happy Birthday." There were a couple of wrapped boxes and a pile of cards, most of which were from my extended family since they lived out of state. Most of the gifts were silly and forgettable, but I remember that a kid named Brian gave me a Mighty Max toy shaped like a snake that I kept for years afterwards. My mom was insistent that I open all the cards and thank each person who had given one, because several years before, on Christmas, I had torn through wrapping paper and envelopes with such a fervor that I had destroyed any possibility of discerning who had sent which gift or which amount of money. We separated the ones that had been sent by mail and the ones that had been brought that day so that my friends couldn't... We separated the ones that had been sent by mail and the ones that had been brought that day so my friends wouldn't have to sit through me opening cards from people that they'd never met. Most of the cards from my friends had a few dollars in them. One envelope didn't have my name written on it, but it was in the pile, so I opened it. The card had some birthday balloons on its face and seemed to be a card that had been received by someone else who was now recycling it for my birthday, because it was a little dingy. I actually appreciated the idea that it was a reused card, since I'd always thought the cards were silly. I angled it so that the money wouldn't fall on the floor when I opened it, but the only thing inside was a message that had come printed in the card. "I love you." Whoever had given me this card hadn't written anything on it, but they had circled the message in pencil a couple times. I chuckled a little and said, "Gee, thanks for the awesome card, Mom." She looked at me inquisitively, and then turned her attention to the card. She told me it wasn't from her, and seemed amused as she took the card from my hand and showed my friends, looking at their faces, trying to discern who had played the joke. None of the kids stepped forward, so my mom said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. At least you know now that 2 people love you." She followed that with an extremely prolonged and excruciating kiss on my forehead that transformed the group's bewilderment into hysteria. They were all laughing now, so it could have been any of them. But one of the boys named Mike seemed to be laughing the hardest. To become a participant rather than the subject of a gag, I said to him that just because he'd given me that card, he shouldn't think that I'd kiss him later. He gave me a slightly bewildered look, and we all laughed. And as I looked at Josh, I saw that he was finally smiling. Well, I think this gift might be the winner, but you have a couple more to open. My mom slid another present in front of me. I was still feeling the tremors of suppressed chuckles in my abdomen as I tore the colorful paper away. When I saw the gift, however, there was no more laughter in me to stifle. My smile dropped as I looked at what I'd been given. It was a pair of walkie-talkies. Well, go on, show everyone, my mother encouraged. I held them up, and everyone seemed to approve, but as I drew my attention to Josh, I could see that he had turned a sickly shade of white. We locked eyes for a moment, and then he turned and walked into the kitchen. As I watched him dial a number on a corded phone attached to the wall, my mom whispered in my ear that she knew that Josh and I didn't talk as much since one of the walkie-talkies had broken, so she thought I'd like it. I was filled with intense appreciation for my mom's thoughtfulness, but this feeling was easily overpowered by the emotions resurrected by the returning memories I'd tried so hard to bury. While everyone was eating cake, I asked Josh whom he had called. He told me he wasn't feeling well, so he called his dad to come get him. I understood that he wanted to leave, but it was so hard to get Josh to come to my house that I, perhaps selfishly, wished that he would stay, despite how he was feeling. I told him I wished that we could hang out more. I extended one of the walkie-talkies to him, but he put up his hand in refusal. Dejected, I said, "Well, thanks for coming, I guess. I hope I'll see you before my next birthday." "I'm sorry. I'll try to call you back more often. I really will," he said. The conversation stalled as we waited by my door for his dad. The rest of the kids watched my mom's coworker perform magic. Rather than sounds of amazement, most of the vocalizations were critical, but in good fun. Despite the haranguing, the magician and my mother seemed happy. Perhaps it was exactly what they had expected. I repeatedly opened my mouth as if words would just pour out and catch the interest of my friend. But I would silently shut it each time. I looked at his face. Josh seemed genuinely remorseful that he hadn't made more of an effort, but I thought I perceived some other brooding emotion behind his regret, though I couldn't tell what it was. As I stared at him, perhaps a little too intensely, his mood seemed suddenly bolstered by an idea that struck him. He looked over at me and said that he knew what he'd get me for my birthday. It would take a while, but he thought that I would really like it. I dismissed it outright. I told him it wasn't a big deal and that I didn't need a gift. But he insisted. He seemed in better spirits and apologized for being such a drag at the party. He said that he would call me soon. And when I said that he didn't have to treat me like a baby, he told me that if he didn't bother to call, then he wasn't worth being friends with anyway. There was a knock at the door. Josh opened it and stepped out of my house and next to his father, and I could see Veronica sitting in the truck, waiting impatiently. I thought about giving Josh a hug, but realized it might be embarrassing for the both of us, so I gave him a low five. He apologized again as he walked off. He said that he was tired and that he hadn't been sleeping well, and I asked him why that was. He turned back toward me and waved goodbye as he answered my question. "I think I've been sleepwalking." That was the last time I saw my friend, and a couple of months later, he was gone. Since I began this attempt to learn more about my childhood, the relationship between my mother and me has grown increasingly strained. Each time she would give me a piece of my past, I could feel myself becoming more complete, the structure of my autobiography finally falling into place with the connection of milestones, or the introduction of a never-known fact. But I don't think I realized how much of herself she was losing in the process. Still, I thought we could take it, but maybe I was letting my wishes about the strength of our bond distort my perception of how strong it actually was. It's often the case that one cannot know the breaking point of a thing until it fractures. The last conversation I had with my mother left me with what I'll now share with you. I'm not sure where this last discussion and all the ones that preceded it will leave me and my mom. I imagine that we'll spend the rest of our lives attempting to repair what had taken a lifetime to build. She had put so much energy into keeping me safe, both physically and psychologically, but I think that the walls meant to insulate me from harm were also protecting her emotional stability. As the truth came pouring out the last time we spoke, I could hear a trembling in her voice that I think was the reverberation of the collapse of her world. I don't imagine my mother and I will talk very much anymore, and while there are still some things I don't understand, I think I know enough now. After Josh disappeared, his parents had done all they could to find him. From the very first day, the police had suggested that they contact all of the parents of the kids that knew Josh to see if he might be with them. They did this, of course, but no one had seen him or had any idea of where he might be. They placed notices in the newspaper and posted flyers all around the old neighborhood. They even solicited message boards and chat rooms in missing children networks. The police had been unable to turn over any new information about Josh's whereabouts, despite the fact that they had received several anonymous phone calls from a woman urging them to compare this case with the stalking case that had been opened about 6 years before. One day, however, they got a call. The person said he had seen Josh. Josh's father sat down on the couch with his wife. Holding a pen to a pad of paper, he asked the caller where he'd seen the boy. The caller said, "In Florida." Father pressed further. Where in Florida did you see him?" The caller yelled, "At Disneyland!" and laughed and hung up. His wife was clutching his free hand, waiting for the information. She asked what the person had said, and Josh's father tore the piece of paper that read, "Florida, Diz," out of the pad and crumpled it up. Nothing. It was nothing. These calls persisted for months. People from all over the country would call and offer fake tips or brutal mockery. There weren't many of these calls, maybe a dozen. But there were enough. They couldn't just change the number. Josh might call, or at least someone who had actually seen him. So they transferred the phone number to a friend who offered to act as a buffer for these kinds of calls. The friend said that she would press anyone who asked about Josh, but otherwise, she would just treat it as an ordinary wrong number. She was a good friend to them, and my mother struggled to remember her name, but I already knew it from the last time I had talked to her. Her name was Claire. Josh's mother was not as strong as her husband was. If her grip on the world loosened when her son vanished, it broke when Veronica died. She had seen so many people die at the hospital, but there was no amount of desensitization that can fortify a person against the death of her own child. She would visit Veronica twice a day, since she was recuperating at a different hospital, once before her shift and once afterward. On the day Veronica died, her mother was late leaving work, and by the time she arrived at her daughter's hospital, Veronica had already passed. This was too much for her, and over the next couple of weeks, she became increasingly more unstable. She stopped going to work, but unlike the leave of absence she had taken almost 3 years before when Josh had disappeared, this time she had nothing to focus her attention on except her own pain. She would sometimes wander outside yelling for both Josh and Veronica to come home, and there were several times her husband found her staggering around my old neighborhood in the middle of the night, half-clothed and frantically searching for her son and daughter. Due to his wife's mental deterioration, Josh's dad could no longer travel for work, so he began taking construction jobs that were less lucrative in an effort to stay closer to home. When they began expanding my old neighborhood more, about 3 months after Veronica died, Josh's dad applied for literally every position that was vacant. He was hired. Although he was qualified to lead the building sites, he took a job as a laborer. He would help build the frames and clean up sites and do whatever else needed to be done. He even took odd jobs that would occasionally come up, mowing lawns, repairing fences, anything to keep from traveling. When they began clearing the woods in the area next to the tributary in order to transform the land into an inhabitable property, Josh's dad was tasked with the responsibility of leveling the recently deforested lot. He accepted it eagerly, as this job guaranteed him at least several weeks of work close to home. On the fourth day, he arrived at the spot that he could not level. Each time he would drive over it with a machine, the patch of land would remain lower than all the surrounding earth. Frustrated, he got off the tractor to survey the area. He was tempted to simply pack more dirt into the depression, but he knew that it would only be aesthetic and temporary solution. He had worked construction for years, and he knew that the root systems from large trees that had been recently cut down would often decompose, leaving weaknesses in the soil below that would manifest as weaknesses in the foundations above. Part of his motivation to do the job thoroughly was out of self-interest. With any luck, he would be contracted to help with the building, or at least placing, of future homes on the property, so he didn't want to sabotage himself. But this was only a small part of his reasoning. Ultimately, he was a builder. Ignoring the problem was simply not a possibility. He weighed his options and elected to dig a little with a shovel, in case the problem was shallow enough to fix without needing a backhoe that he would have to retrieve from another site. I asked my mother where the site was, but it was almost a rhetorical question. I knew where it was. I had been to the spot before the soil was broken and before it had been filled in. I had fallen in that hole when I was 10 years old. I felt a tightening in my chest as my mother continued. He stabbed the shovel into the dirt to test its consistency, and to his surprise and disappointment, the shovel had disappeared almost entirely below the earth. The soil was weak, and while it would make it easier to move, he had not anticipated that it might be such an expensive delay so soon into the job. Pulling back on the wooden handle, he removed a small amount of dirt off to the side and began his project. Before too long, he had dug a small hole about 3 feet down. When he reset his position and drove the metal blade into the earth, a tremor traveled up the pole and into his arms. His shovel had collided with something hard. He smashed his shovel against it repeatedly in an attempt to gauge the thickness of the root and the density of the network, when suddenly his shovel plunged through the resistance. Confused, he dug the hole wider. After about a half hour of excavating, he found himself standing on a brown blanket that was stretched across and stapled to a large box about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Our minds work hard to avoid dissonance. If we hold the belief strongly enough, our minds will forcefully reject conflicting evidence, so that we can maintain the integrity of our understanding of the world. Up until the very next moment, despite what all reason would have indicated, despite the fact that some small but suffocated part of him understood what was supporting his weight, this man believed, he knew, his son was still alive. My mom received a call at 6 o'clock in the evening. She knew who it was, but she couldn't understand what he was saying. However, what she did comprehend made her leave immediately. "Down here! Now! Son! Please, God!" When she arrived, she found Josh's dad sitting perfectly still with his back to the hole. He was holding a shovel so tightly that it seemed that it might snap. He was staring straight ahead with eyes that had no life or light in them. My mother approached him slowly and tried several times to get his attention, but he wouldn't respond to any of her words. He only reacted when she tried, with delicate and hesitant hands, to take the shovel from him. When she touched the shovel, his vice-like grip on the handle tightened, forcing all the blood out of his fingers to the point where they were white as bone. He dragged his eyes slowly to hers and just said, "I don't understand." He repeated this as if he had forgotten all other words, and my mother could hear him still muttering it as she walked past both him and the scraps of broken wood to look in the hole. My mother told me that she wished that she had gouged her eyes out before she faced downward into the crater, and I told her that I knew what she was about to say, and that she need not continue. I looked at her face. It was expressing a look of such intense despair that it caused my stomach to turn. It struck me that she had known of this for almost 10 years, and was hoping she'd never have to tell me. I imagined that she made a firm decision all those years ago to never share this information. As we sat there at the same weathered table that had forever been the meeting spot for our talks, I felt a twinge of guilt for forcing her to break the promise that she made to herself. Because she never intended to tell me, she never came up with a proper arrangement of words to describe what she saw. As I sit here now, I met with the same difficulty of articulation, but for different reasons. Josh was dead. His face was sunken in and contorted in such a way that it was as if the misery and hopelessness of all the world had been transferred to it. The assaulting smell of decay rose from the crypt, and my mother had to cover her nose and mouth to keep from vomiting. His skin was cracked, almost crocodilian, and a stream of blood followed these lines and dried on his face while pooling and staining the wood around his head. My mother wanted to look away. She wanted to move her eyes, even if just a little bit, so that she could see something else, anything else. But she couldn't. Her eyes had locked with Josh's, which lay open and facing up out of the tomb. And although he couldn't return her gaze, it felt as if he were looking directly at her. She said by the look of him, he had not been long dead, but she couldn't hazard a guess because she simply had no reference. Selfishly and horribly, she wished that more time had passed before that day, so that time and nature could have brought the mercy of degradation to erase the pain and terror that was now etched into his face. She said it had felt as if he knew she'd be there, that he had been waiting for her to enter his line of sight, his mouth offering an all-too-late plea for help to ears that could do nothing for him. She forcefully covered her eyes to break the stare and attempt to confront the scene as a whole, but the rest of his body wasn't visible. Someone else was covering it. He was large and lay face down on top of Josh. As my mother's mind stretched itself to take in what her eyes were attempting to tell her, she became aware of the significance of the way in which he was laid. He was holding Josh. Their legs lay frozen by death, but entangled like vines in some lush tropical forest. One arm rested under Josh's neck, only to wrap around his body so they might lay closer still, while the other arm lay limp, with a bent elbow against the wood, his fingers tangled in Josh's hair. The man's back was covered in dirt, and as she looked back to the area near Josh's head, ashamedly avoiding his gaze, she could see that some of the scattered earth had mixed with the blood and formed mud that lay still wet in the damp casket. The sun had passed through the trees, its light reflected off of something pinned to Josh's shirt. My mother stooped to one knee and raised the collar of her shirt to her nose so that she might block out the smell while she attempted to train her vision on the object rather than Josh's face. When she saw what had caught the sunlight, her legs abandoned her, and she nearly fell into the tomb. It was a picture. It was a picture of me, as a child. Gasping and trembling, she staggered backwards and collided with Josh's father, who still lay facing away from the hole. She understood why he had called her now, but she could not bring herself to tell him what she had kept from everyone for all these years. Not that the information would do any good now, anyway. Josh's family never knew about the night I had woken up in the woods. They never knew about the Polaroids. They never knew about the note she had found on my pillow. They never knew the real reason we had moved out of our old home in such a haste. She had moved us to a new house to protect my life, and she had kept all of those things a secret so that life might be a normal one. She had talked to the police. She knew now that she should have talked to Josh's parents, but there was nothing to say anymore. As she sat there resting her back against Josh's father's, he spoke. I can't tell my wife. I can't tell her that our little boy... His speech staggered into fits as he pressed his wet face into his dirt-caked hands. She couldn't bear it. After a moment, he stood up, still shuddering, and lumbered toward the grave. With a final sob, he stepped down to the coffin and positioned himself over the dead man's body. Josh's dad was a big man, but not as big as the man in the box was. However, he seemed unable to grasp this fact. He grabbed the back of the man's collar and pulled hard. It was as if he intended to throw the man out of the grave in a singular motion. But the collar ripped, and the body fell back down on top of his son. As this happened, what air remained in Josh's lungs was violently forced out through his mouth, and his father shrieked as he both watched and heard his son's last empty breath. "You motherfucker!" He grabbed the man by the shoulders and heaved him back until he was off Josh completely. With one final, straining motion, he shoved the man until the body sat awkwardly but upright against the wall of the grave. Josh's father rested his hands on his knees and breathed heavily and painfully as he looked down at his only son. He grunted in anger and turned his attention to the man. My mother could see the rage despair from his eyes as something else replaced it. He staggered back a step, and then another. "Oh God. Oh God, no, 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 please, God, no, no, no!" In a struggling but powerful movement, he lifted and pushed the corpse of the man completely out of the ground. As he did this, there was a distinct sound of glass first hitting and then rolling against the wood. It was a bottle. He picked it up and absently handed it to my mother. It was ether. "Oh, Josh!" He grabbed and cradled his son. "My boy, my baby boy! Why is there so much blood? What did he do to you?" As my mother looked at the man who now lay facing upwards, a chill came over her as she realized that she was facing, for the first time, the person who had haunted our lives for over a decade. Everything about our lives had changed since this person had entered it, and she had lost so much sleep thinking about this man. When she pictured him, whether in waking life or a dream, he was always evil and always terrifying. The cries of Josh's father seemed to confirm her worst fears. But as she stared at his face, she thought that this didn't look like who she imagined at all. This was just a man. As she looked upon his frozen expression, it actually looked serene. The corners of his lips were turned up only slightly. She saw that he was smiling. It wasn't the expected smile of a manic from a film or a horror story. It wasn't the smile of a demon or the smile of a fiend. It was the smile of contentment or satisfaction. It was a smile of bliss. It was a smile of love. When she looked down from his face, she saw a tremendous wound on his neck from where the skin had been ripped out. She realized that this wound must have been the source of the blood that stained Josh's face and the wood upon which his head rested. Initially, she was relieved by the realization that the blood had not been Josh's. Perhaps he had suffered less, and in a strange way, this small comfort amidst the madness set her slightly at ease. She looked at Josh's father, who sat in the coffin, still holding his son to his chest, and wondered if she should tell him. She wondered if this tiny consolation was worth distracting him from his own thoughts, whatever they might be. She drew her eyes away for a moment to think, and they lingered on the scraps of wood that lay scattered to one side of the hole, many of them still connected to a large, brown blanket. She recognized that these pieces of wood must have been the top of the box that Josh's father had torn away before calling her. Her drifting eyes and wandering thoughts both suddenly focused on what she saw in the debris, and she realized that she had been wrong to hope for any comfort now, in this place. Her mind raced to make excuses for this object's existence, but she was too tired to listen to anything but the truth anymore. She stared at the metal handle that was screwed into one of the boards of wood. She brought a hand up to her mouth and whispered, almost as if she was afraid to remind the world of what had happened. They were alive. Josh must have bitten the man's neck in a desperate attempt to get free, and although the man had died, Josh wasn't strong enough to move him. When my mother realized this, she began to cry at the thought of how long he might have laid there and how he must have felt. She shuddered at the thought that he wouldn't have been able to see in that dark place. She crouched down beside the man and looked through his pockets for some kind of identification, but she only found a piece of paper. On it was a stick figure drawing of a man holding hands with a small boy, and next to the boy were initials. She told me that the initials were mine. She asked me if I understood what it might mean, and I lied to her and said that I did not. As Josh's father carried his son out of the grave, my mom slid the piece of paper into her pocket and stood up. He was muttering that his son's hair had been dyed, but he wasn't talking to my mother. It seemed almost as if he had forgotten that she was there. When she looked at Josh, she understood what his father was saying. Josh's hair was now dark brown, though it almost looked black as it clung to itself, cemented by blood. Josh's dad delicately laid his boy on the soft dirt and began gently pressing his hands against his son's pants to feel his pockets. My mother noticed that Josh was oddly dressed. His clothes were far too small for a boy his size. As the father applied pressure to his son's left pocket, there was a crinkle. Carefully, he retrieved the folded piece of paper from Josh's pocket and slowly unfolded it, not knowing what it might be. As he was returning the paper to its original shape, a small key fell from its folds and onto the dirt. He picked it up and looked at it, as if he expected it to say something to him. After a moment, he pushed it into his front pocket before returning his attention to the paper. He studied it, but was vexed. With no immediate meaningful information to be gained from it, he handed the piece of paper to my mother. She nervously accepted it, but she didn't recognize it either. When I asked her what it was, she told me that it was a map, and I felt my heart shatter. Josh was finishing the map. That must have been his idea for my birthday present. He had resumed the expedition on his own. That was our first great adventure, and he had decided to finish it. For me. For us. Tears began streaming out of my eyes as I learned this, and I found myself desperately hoping that he hadn't been taken while working on it. Despite everything that had happened, he had kept the map in his pocket for almost 3 years. She heard Josh's father grunt angrily and turned to see him pushing the man's body back into the ground. As he walked back toward the machine that had found the spot for him, he put his hand on a canister of gasoline and paused with his back toward my mother. "You should go." I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" "It's not your fault. It was me. I did this." You can't think like that. There was nothing." "I did this," he roared. There was silence for a long time. He seemed to be searching for the right words, or maybe he was just searching for a decision about whether he wanted to say them at all. Finally, he continued, his voice flat with almost no emotion at all. "About a month ago, I was cleaning up a site on the new development a block over when a guy approached me. He asked if I wanted to make some extra money. Well, with my wife not working, I'd take just about any job, so I asked him about it. He said that some kids had dug a bunch of holes on his property, and he offered me $100 to fill them in. I told him that was no problem, just tell me where and when. He had said that he wanted to take some pictures for the insurance company first, but if I came back after 8 p.m. the next day, that would be fine. He'd said I have no problem finding the holes. I thought this guy was a sucker, since I knew that clearing the lot was coming up for the crew that I was on, so somebody would have had to do it anyway. I actually felt bad for taking his money. It didn't even look like he'd have $100, but he put the bill in my hand, and I did the job the next night. I'd been so exhausted that I didn't even think about it after it was done. I didn't think about it. There was a long pause as he seemed to lose control of his voice. I didn't think about it until today, when I pulled that same guy off my son. He pointed at the grave, and his emotions finally broke free as tears fell from his eyes and mucus from his nose. He paid me $100 so I would bury him and my boy. It was as if saying it aloud forced him to accept that it had happened, and he collapsed onto the ground in tears. My mother could think of nothing to say, so she stood there in silence for what felt like a lifetime as she tried to comprehend what he had just told her. She knew that he wouldn't tell his wife about any of this. My mother knew that this would be the only time when he could reach out for any comfort at all. She knelt down and held him while he cried for his son. Finally, she asked what he would do about Josh, where he would take him. But all he said was, his final resting place won't be here with this monster. He rose and stepped delicately around his boy, while he walked toward the grave with his canister of gasoline in his hand. My mother left what used to be my old woods, but was now just a mausoleum with no walls. As she looked back when she reached her car, she could see black smoke billowing and diffusing against the amber sky, and she hoped against all hope that Josh's parents would be okay. When my mother had finished her story, we sat in silence for a long time. I wanted to feel anger or agony, but I felt nothing but a hollow emptiness inside. As we sat there, I realized that Josh's parents had called my mother when Josh went missing. She must have lied to them in the same way that she had lied to me. Josh's parents must still believe to this day that their son really ran away. I stood up to leave. There was only one question that I had for my mother. Only one thing that I wanted to know from her, but she couldn't answer it. I don't know why I had expected that she could. I left my mom's house without saying much else. I told her that I loved her, and that I would talk to her again soon, but I didn't know what soon meant for us now. I got into my car and left. As I drove, that stupid riddle about going into the woods came back into my mind, and that was enough to make me feel again. I remember Josh and me talking about it in those woods nearly half my lifetime ago. I cried so hard that I had to pull my car over, and I asked the question that my mother had been unable to answer. I asked it aloud, even though no one was around to answer it but me. Why Josh? It was supposed to be me. It had always been me. So why wasn't it when it mattered the most? Why did I wake up in the winter woods when I was a child instead of being entombed in them? Why couldn't it have stopped then, with me? But I'll never know the answer to this question. I'll never know why he just left me there. There's no one I can ask now. Maybe he just couldn't do it. Maybe he tried, but in the end he was just too weak to take me. As I sat there in my car on the side of the road, I struggled to breathe between exhausted sobs. I collapsed on the steering wheel and whimpered that I wished he had been stronger. I understood now. As the story became clearer with each detail revealed through conversations with my mother, I had watched the pieces fall into place. But I still couldn't understand why it had all stopped so long ago. Why it had all simply ended. Sitting in my car that night, I saw it all clearly for the first time. As an adult, I could see the connections that were lost on a child who tends to see the world in snapshots rather than a sequence. The picture was complete, but I wished I had never seen it at all. I left the gas station and drove the rest of the way home, and thought, this is all that's left for me to do anymore. I think about Josh. I loved him then, and I love him even still. I miss him more now that I know I'll never see him again, and I find myself wishing that I had hugged him the last time I saw him. I wish that he could have stayed at my birthday party longer that day. Even if we didn't say another word to one another, we could have just sat there. That would have been nice. I think about Josh's parents, how much they had lost and how quickly that loss had come. They were good people, kind people. The father had called my mother that terrible day so that she could keep me safe. But no one had called him to help him protect Josh. His parents didn't know about my connection to any of this, but I could never look them in the eyes now. We still live in the same town, and I worry every day that I'll run into them somewhere. I find myself hoping that I don't see them, and I feel sick when I have that thought. I think about Veronica. I had only really come to know her later in my life, but for those few brief weeks, I think I had really loved her. I think about my mother. She had tried so hard to protect me. She had done everything she possibly could do to keep me safe. She was stronger than I'll ever be. I think about what our lives might be like now if I had just let my balloon go with Chris's, or even a single second sooner or later than I did. Maybe somebody else would have found it and everyone would be okay. Maybe I'd still have my friend and his parents would still have a son. Josh had been missing for almost 3 years, almost a fifth of his life. I try to pretend that I don't know what the man might have done with Josh for all that time, just like I try to pretend that maybe Josh wasn't in the passenger seat that night Veronica was hit. I find myself pretending a lot now. But mostly, I just think about Josh. Sometimes I wish that he never sat across from me that day in kindergarten, that I'd never known what it was like to have a real friend. Sometimes I like to dream that he's in a better place now, but that's only a dream, and I know it. The world is a cruel place, made crueler still by man. There would be no justice for my friend, no final confrontation, no vengeance. It had been over for almost a decade now, for everyone but me. I miss you, Josh. I'm sorry that you chose me, but I'll always cherish my memories of you. We were explorers. We were adventurers. We were friends. Sleep tight until next year.